Good afternoon, everyone. Hope everybody's doing okay. See if anybody else comes to join us this afternoon, but I hope everybody's doing well. This is VBS Online, Lunch and Learn for a beautiful April afternoon. So today is an interesting day. Today is Yom HaZikaron. Today's Israeli Memorial Day. It's a very, very solemn day in Israel. It's a day that every family in Israel goes to the cemetery to visit the graves of those who have fallen in battle or those who have been taken in terrorist attacks. And there's no family in Israel that isn't touched in some way very deeply with some deep, deep, terrible loss. And it's really it's a solemn and powerful day because whole communities, whole families go to the cemetery. And of course, most of the graves, most of them, but are for people who are very young. A lot of graves of kids in their 18, 19 years, 20s, because they were soldiers and they died in the wars, or young people who were taken in terrorist activities. And that's what the whole day is. During the day, the TV stations play very serious documentaries on the history of Israel. And there's a chyron, sort of that strip at the bottom. But instead of headlines, it has the names of those who are being remembered today. And at the end of the day, when sun goes down, a siren will sound. And at the end of the day, when the siren sounds, they move directly from Yom HaZikaron to Yom HaAtzmaut, from this day of solemn remembrance to a day of wild, wonderful celebration of Israel independence. There's a big ceremony. It's held at the Kotel Plaza, and they invite a number of sort of people from around the world to celebrate Yom HaAtzmaut by lighting torches. There's a whole very interesting story about how these torches are lit, how they choose the people. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing to see. And then the whole country goes sort of crazy. They have a big party for the whole night. It's a wonderful thing to go from such sadness to such joy over literally in a moment, which is quite remarkable. So what I thought we'd do today is, I know I promised to take you back to the Bible, and I will do that, but I thought that would be interesting today to start with, to look at two documents that have to do with this wonderful moment of Yom HaAtzmaut. And to understand something about the people who originally celebrated this. So the first document that I'd like to show is a song that you probably all know. It's the song Hatikva. Hatikva was a poem. It was written by Naftali Tzvi Imber, who was an Eastern European Jew, in 1878. Now, just to give you a sense of the context, the first Zionist Congress isn't held till 1897. But you have already, and Herzl doesn't become a big Zionist. I mean, 1978, he was 18 years old. What you have in 1878 are the first stirrings of the movement to return to Eretz Yisrael, the first stirrings of the movement to think about a Jewish place, a Jewish country. The first stirrings of that movement, and Naftali Tzvi Imber writes this poem. He wrote it as a poem. He didn't intend it to be a national anthem. He didn't intend it even to be a song. It was later put to music, and the music that it was put to was a Central European folk song. If you've ever listened to that piece of music called the Moldau, you'll recognize the same melody. Dum, 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 dum. It's a very common Central European trope, a theme, a musical theme. But because the Central Europeans were the ones who dominated the Zionist conversation, they got to pick the melody. And the statement that Naftali Tzvi Imber makes in this poem is a remarkable statement, and it gives you a sense of the context of Zionism, of at least early Zionism. So let's take a look together. You all probably know the words by heart. Kol od balevav penima, nefesh Yehudi homia, ulefate mizrach kadima. Now, it's interesting because the way we read it, he's an Eastern European Jew, so he speaks Ashkenazis, right? So one of the differences between Ashkenazic and Sephardic Hebrew is where you put the accent in a word, okay? Sephardic Hebrew, which is common spoken Hebrew now, Israeli common spoken Hebrew, the Hebrew I learned as a kid, puts the accent on the end of the word, the last syllable, talit, kippah, right? But Ashkenazis Hebrew, which is the way I learned how to daven, puts the accent earlier, right? So it's talis, tefillin, right? You hear the difference there? You see the difference in the rhythm of the word? So you can hear that this was written in Ashkenazic Hebrew, because in order to make it rhyme, you've got to speak the Ashkenazi. So it's kolod balevav pnima, nefesh Yehudi homia, ulefate mizrach kadima, ayin litzion sophia. You see that? And what happens is, really, this shouldn't be here because it's really one sentence. It's really one sentence. And the one sentence says this: Kol od balevav pinima nefesh Yehudi homia. As long as the Jewish spirit, or as long as in the heart within, nefesh Yehudi homia, the Jewish spirit still yearns, ulefate mizrach kadima ayin litzion sophia, and toward the east, an eye toward Zion is looking, comma, that's a subjunctive clause. Odlo ava tikvatenu, we haven't yet lost our faith or our hope. Hatikva bachnat alpayim, the 2,000-year-old hope. Liot am chavshi ba'artzenu, to be a free people in our land. Eretz Sion Yerushalayim. What an interesting, how many national anthems forget to mention the name of the country? I mean, America's national anthem, we don't have the name of the country in the America's national anthem, right? But it's, you see, Ayin Litzion Yerushalayim, they didn't call it Israel until a little bit later. He's thinking about Sion and Yerushalayim. But listen to the statement that he makes. What's the statement that he makes? That the Jew, you know that the Jewish spirit is alive if Jews still turn toward the east, toward Yerushalayim, toward Israel. And when they pray, that Jews still are looking there for our hope. Our hope will come from the east. That's where our hope will come. Now, what is he denying? I think it's always important when you read an ideological statement to ask yourself, what's the opposite? Like, who is he arguing with? He's Jewish. He's got to be arguing with somebody, right? Who is he arguing with, right? Odlo avda tikvateno hatikva bachnata. Who is he arguing with? Well, we'll take a look at it one more time, right? Let's take a look at this one more time, right? Kolod balevav penima nefesh Yehudi homiyat. So as long as Jews are looking toward the east, right? Odlo avda tikvateno hatikva bachnat alpayim. As long as we're looking to the east for our redemption, as long as Israel remains the center of our focus, as long as the land of Israel, the city of Yerushalayim, are of a central concern to Jewish life, we haven't lost our hope. Now, the middle line is Od lo avda tikvatenu. That's the middle line of the poem. The name of the poem is Tikvatenu, our hope. Where did he get that line, Od lo avda tikvatenu? He got it from the Bible. He got it from the prophet Ezekiel in the 37th chapter of Ezekiel, which is the famous prophecy of the dry bones. Now, remember who Ezekiel was. In 586 BCE, the Babylonians conquered Jerusalem and take away its upper classes. Ezekiel is a priest, and he's taken away to exile. And by the waters of Babylon, there we sat and there we wept as we remembered Zion. And Ezekiel was one of them. But then he begins having prophetic visions, which already is interesting because you would think that prophetic visions would be limited to Israel. But he's having prophetic visions out there in Babylon. And what is he saying to the people? He's saying to the people, you will soon return to your land. You will soon rebuild your city. You will soon worship in a new holy temple of Jerusalem. And the most powerful chapter in the whole book of Ezekiel, Yechezkel, is the 37th chapter, which is the valley of the dry bones. God takes him in his dreams into this valley, and it's covered with all these bones. And God says to him, prophesy. And he starts to prophesy, and the bones start to come together. Sinews start to grow on these bones, and these bones rise up as newly reborn people. And God says to him, this is the people Israel. And Ezekiel says to God, my people have lost their hope. Avda tikvatenu. That's the phrase. Avda tikvatenu. We have lost our hope. Our people have no hope of redemption, no hope of returning, no hope of living again. And God says to him, no, don't lose your hope. This is a symbol of what's going to happen to you. So Od lo avda tikvatenu is the answer to Ezekiel's charge to God that the people Israel had lost their hope of any kind of redemption. And Naftali Tzvi Ingber is saying something very important. He's arguing with all of those who are saying, and by 1878, there was a sizable community who were saying, our hope is in Germany. Our hope is in France. Our hope is in Italy. Our hope is in Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic. For those who are saying that Jewish life is going to flourish when we assimilate into the cultures in which we've lived, this is the beginning of emancipation. And emancipation meant the Jews were invited in, invited to become British, invited to become French, invited to become Germans, invited to become Czech. It didn't happen in Russia, and it barely happened in Poland, but it certainly happened in Western Europe. And the question is, where is your hope? Does your hope lie in the invitation to be welcomed in as a Frenchman, as an Italian, as a British citizen? Is that where your hope lies? Or does your hope lie in the East, where we will go and build a new land and we will be citizens of our own country? Liot am chovshi, not here in France, to be a free people. Liot am chovshi means to be a free people, not in France, not in Germany, not in Austria, not in Italy, but where? The Artsein. And that's the Zionist argument. The Zionist argument, the Zionists argued against two principal foes. On the one hand, the Orthodox, that's in the eastern part of the Europe, Eastern European Orthodoxy, which said, thank you, Eastern European Orthodoxy, which said, only God can redeem us, and Western European Haskalah, or Enlightenment, which said, we will be redeemed by the countries in which we live when they recognize that we are fellow human beings, fellow citizens, and welcome us in. And that's why when Theodor Herzl first publishes The Jewish State in 1896, he's rejected by everybody. He's rejected by everybody. The Eastern European Jews said, what? Only God can redeem us. And the Western European Jews said, shut up, because they were so afraid of being accused of dual loyalty. Baron Rothschild, who was the first person to whom he brought the Jewish state, Baron Rothschild kicked him out of his mansion because Baron Rothschild wanted to be a Frenchman of the Mosaic persuasion. And the first line of Herzl's book, The Jewish State, says, we are a people. We are a people, one people. We are not a faith. We are not a spiritual tradition alone. We are a people. We are with its own culture and its own identity and its own loyalty. And when you say that Baron Rothschild was so afraid that would fuel the anti-Semites who were so reticent to allow Jews in to begin with, because that's everything the anti-Semites were afraid of. Jews won't be loyal. They won't be loyal to France. They won't be loyal to England. They won't be loyal to Austria or to Germany or to Italy. They'll be loyal to their own. Same thing in America, by the way. Same thing in America. 1915, Woodrow Wilson, President of the United States, attends a naturalization ceremony for new Americans, and he says to them, you are not German Americans. You are not Polish Americans. You are not Italian or French Americans. You are just Americans. And any addition, any hyphenated identity, compromises the purity of your American identity. Well, so the reform movement in America violently objected to Zionism up until 1967, because they saw it as an invitation to anti-Semitism. They saw it as an invitation to a charge of dual loyalty. Naftali Tzvi Ingber and Theodor Herzl, who followed him, felt that was a bargain we couldn't make, because we will always have our own identity. We will always be our own people. And only with a place in the world that recognizes that can we ever be really free. And that's the beginning of the Zionist movement, the beginning of the Zionist vision. Now, let's tell a story. November 29th, 1947, the United Nations votes to partition Palestine. Remember, Palestine is Israel and Jordan, the two countries, right? Which today Israel and Jordan. They were assigned to the British by the Sykes-Picot Treaty that took place just before the end of the First World War. At the end of the First World War, the Middle East was divided up among the great colonial powers. That's why if you ever look at a map of the Middle East, if you see straight line borders, you know that was a diplomatic invention, because there's no straight line borders in nature. But the nations, the land of the Middle East was divvied up by French and British and German and Italian diplomats. And England gets Jordan and Britain gets Jordan and Israel, which is now Jordan and Israel. That's called Palestine. And a commission is set up to figure out, how do you govern this Palestine, the Peel Commission, because it was full of all kinds of violence, because the Arabs were pushing back against the growing Jewish community. And that commission, the Peel Commission, recommends partition, divide the land, just divide it out. So first they divide Jordan away from Israel. That is, the Jordan River becomes the boundary, and everything to the east of the Jordan River becomes the Hashemite kingdom, given to the Hashemite dynasty because of their loyalty to the British, even though they're a minority rule there. And then you have everything which is from the Mediterranean to the Jordan. And the Peel Commission recommends to the British government that we divide it. We simply divide it. So in 1947, November 29th, 1947, the United Nations votes to divide it, creating a Jewish state and an Arab state within the land between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. And the Jewish state would have been very truncated, but it would have been a Jewish state. So the leadership of the Jewish community of Eretz Yisrael and the leadership of the Zionist movement accepted it. They accepted that idea, right? Yes, there was a two-state solution at the very beginning, exactly right. And what happens is the British announce that they're going to take 6 months and then leave. And whatever happens in the land, that's what's going to happen in the land. So Ben-Gurion, who's the leader of the Yishuv Council, the governing council of the settlement, of the Jewish settlement of Eretz Yisrael, announces that he's going to declare independence as soon as the British leave. And the British were sort of like trivially anti-Semitic. So they choose May 15th, which is a Friday, knowing full well that they're going to pull out right before Shabbos, right? Like that really was on purpose. Like mamish, right before Shabbos, we'll pull out. So what happens is there's this big debate. Should Ben-Gurion declare statehood? And the Arab countries declare that if Ben-Gurion declares statehood in the partitioned area of Palestine, then they will invade and destroy and push all the Jews into the sea. And by this time, there's 600,000 Jews living there. So you've just lost 6 million in Europe, but you're ready to lose another 600,000. So this debate goes on, and Ben-Gurion is firm that he's going to fight for independence, but it's a decision that has to be made by the council. So Ben-Gurion, on the day before, decides he's going to convene a council meeting to make this decision. He receives a call from George C. Marshall, who's the United States Secretary of State, General Marshall, like as in the Marshall Plan, who has no love for Jews, but has seen the devastation of the Jewish communities of Europe, and who tells him, don't declare independence because American military intelligence tells us that you can't withstand the attack of these Arab armies. And Ben-Gurion thanks him very much and gets in the car and drives to Tel Aviv. And they convene a council meeting. And there's 13 members of the council, but 3 of them are in British jail. So there's 10 of them. And they start the meeting late in the afternoon and they go till 3 o'clock in the morning. They're Jews after all, right? And they come to a decision at 3 o'clock in the morning. They take a vote. It's Wednesday night, Thursday morning. The British are leaving on Friday. So Thursday morning at 3 o'clock in the morning, they come to this vote and they vote 6-4 to declare independence. So whenever you think about the miracle, the state of Israel, understand that miracles happen by a vote of 6-4, which means if somebody had a headache, you wouldn't have had a state of Israel. And then Ben-Gurion needs a document. So he starts writing a document. He asked Moshe Sharet, who's a well-trained European lawyer, to help him write this document. And they work all day on the document. They circulate it through a bunch of friends. And then Sharet takes it home to wordsmith it. And he works on it all night. And the next day, they set up the declaration, the Israeli independence ceremony. They decide that the most secure building in Tel Aviv to have it is Dizengoff's basement. Dizengoff, his name was Meir Dizengoff, but he also happened to be the mayor of Tel Aviv. So it's Mayor Meir Dizengoff has a house with a basement. Well, more or less, it's a half basement. Today, it's an art museum, and that's where they're going to declare independence, because if the building gets bombed, it could withstand a bombing. And they say, we don't have much room. It's a very small room. So everybody, they invited the Yeshuv Council. They invited Rabbi Fishman, who was the chief rabbi of Palestine. They invited a few friends, and they said to them, don't tell anybody. We don't want a crowd, because if the Arabs bomb it, we don't want anybody to die. So Sharet finishes the document. The ceremony is supposed to begin at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. He finishes the document at like 2:30, and he calls it, and he gets in a cab, and the cab is trying to get him to the ceremony, and the cab gets stopped in heavy traffic. And he asks the cab driver, what's the problem? And the cab driver says, there's some stupid ceremony at Dizengoff's house, and I can't get through the traffic. And Sharet says, yeah, it's me. It's this document. We're signing this document. So the cab driver gets out and flags down a cop on a motor scooter and explains to the cop where he has to go, and puts Sharet on the back of the motor scooter holding the document in his hand. And the motor scooter weaves through the traffic in order to get to Dizengoff's basement. And he walks in like 5 minutes of 3.
Someone's frozen. Rabbi, you're frozen.
Gates.
Rabbi,
Your internet is down or whatever.
He'll be back.
besides, I think it used to be a museum, but now it is a heritage site and is currently under reconstruction. My girlfriend's grandfather was a signator on the Israeli Declaration of Independence.
Wow.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah.
Been there a number of times. They reenact it for tourists.
And that small room, it's pretty amazing because they show you where everybody was sitting, who was there. It's really quite exhilarating to be in that room. I was honored.
Me too.
You've been to the Jewish National Fund house in Tel Aviv?
I don't remember that one. I've gone to Jewish National Fund things. I've gone with Mogen David Adam and Hadassah and many other groups, but I don't remember that.
It's not on the usual tourist itinerary.
Elise, I met you at Steve and Melita's house many years ago.
At whose house?
Steve, Victor, and Melita.
Yes, of course. How are you?
I'm Steve's cousin. I'm fine, thank you.
I remember you.
I remember you too. And you remember my niece Ivy Stein?
Yes.
She recently mentioned your name and I can't remember why.
Uh-oh.
Uh-oh. It was good. It was good.
Good. Hopefully in connection with Israel. So
Maybe. She lives in Newport. I don't know if that has anything to do with it.
if anybody is interested, this Sunday at 10:30 a.m., the Jewish National Fund has a breakfast. LA has already done it, but you could sign up for it in any one of the communities, and it's featuring the couple stars from Fauda.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. My computer's having problems. I apologize. So if I have to, I'll try not to slip out again.
I took over.
I wouldn't have expected anything different. So Anyway, the document gets signed and Rabbi Fishman recites Shechianu, and that's the beginning of the state of Israel. So what I want to do today, if it's okay, is take a look at this document together because it's quite remarkable. This is Israel's Declaration of Independence. Okay, and it's such an interesting document. And what I want to do before we even get into Israel's Declaration of Independence, let's take a moment and look at America's Declaration of Independence. So this is America's Declaration, just because the contrast between the two is so telling. Okay, so we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. All right, look at that first sentence. That's the American Declaration of Independence. Where does it start? It starts with all men, with all human beings. It starts with a universal principle, and the universal principle of equality, of inalienable rights, of a creator of all. It's a universal document. And what Jefferson does in the United States Declaration of Independence is derive the right of American independence from the universal rights of all human beings. And his argument's going to be that the government of Great Britain has violated the universal rights of all human beings. But that's the starting point, is the universal rights of all human beings, right? And that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So it begins with this universal. Now, look at the state of Israel. It's a very different document. It's a very different statement, okay? Right? Eretz Yisrael. So the first two words of the Israeli Declaration of Independence is Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. Okay? It's not about the universal. It begins with the particular. It begins with this people and its story and its history, and why it has a right to this land, and why it needs this land, and why this land belongs to it. Right? What Jefferson was trying to prove with the American Declaration of Independence is why Americans had a right to their independence, because Britain had violated the fundamental rights of human beings that all human beings understand. Ben-Gurion, in this Declaration of Independence, is starting from a very different place. He's starting from the particular experience, the narrative of this particular people, and why this people and this land are indelibly tied together, unbreakably tied together. And therefore, the political ownership of this land is a natural next step to its indelible relationship between the people and this land. Does that make some sense? Right? So Eretz Yisrael, I want to make sure something. Eretz Yisrael was the birthplace of the Jewish people, right? Now already that's an interesting statement, because if you read the Bible, that's not true. Where are we born? According to the Bible, where does God first speak to Abraham? In Ur, when Abraham's living in Ur Kasdim, right? So already that's not exactly even biblically. That's a challengeable proposition, right? But that's not the point. The point isn't that that we may have started someplace else. The point is that there is an indelible, an unerasable, and undeniable connection between this people and this land. Here, their spiritual, religious, and political identity was shaped. Again, a very debatable proposition. Maimonides did not live in Israel. Rashi did not live in Israel. The Talmud was not written in Israel, right? You could argue the proposition, but Ben-Gurion's statement, just like Naftali Tzvi Ingber in the Hatikva, is that this land and this people and its culture are all one. This land and its people and its being, its culture, its expression, its identity is all one. Here they first attained to statehood, created cultural values of national and universal significance, and gave to the world the eternal book of books. After being forcibly exiled from their land, the people kept faith with it throughout their dispersion, and never cease to pray and hope for their return to it and for the restoration in it of their political freedom. Well, the first half of that sentence is true, historically true. Jews did always keep faith with the land of Israel. They never did cease to pray and hope for return to it. But this clause is also debatable. And for the restoration in it of their political freedom, not necessarily so. Not necessarily so, because what they asked for was a Messiah. They hoped for a Messiah to come back and redeem the whole world and redeem us along with the whole world. But the political statement of a state, of a country, that wasn't a biblical idea. That's a modern idea. In other words, Israel as a land we always had a relationship with that. Israel as a dream, that is of a place where we could be free, always had a relationship with that. Israel as a country with a government and an army, not necessarily so. Impelled by this historic and traditional attachment, Jews strove in every successive generation to reestablish themselves in their ancient homeland. Well, again, it's a debatable point. Yes, there always was a Jewish majority in Jerusalem, and in many of the cities of Israel, there were majorities. But frankly, most Jews didn't go to Israel. Most Jews stayed in the diaspora because they were told by their tradition that only God could return us to that. The reestablishment of themselves in success in ancient homeland really came in the late 19th century with the rise of European nationalisms. Jewish nationalism rose as well. In recent decades, they returned in their masses. That's true. Since the end of the 19th century, Jews began returning in very large numbers. Pioneers, mapilim, defenders, they made the deserts bloom, revived the Hebrew language, built villages and towns, and created a thriving community. Somebody could mope, thank you. Controlling its economy and culture, loving peace, but knowing how to defend itself. That's an interesting phrase. Bringing the blessings of progress to all the country's inhabitants and aspiring toward independent nationhood. See, this was a really interesting question. Did the early Zionists understand that there were people living in the land? Some of the land was depopulated, no question. Much of the Galil, for example, was depopulated because it was swampland. And much of the land was owned by Arab landowners who lived in Damascus, but farmed by tenant farmers who lived on the land. The early Zionists, there were many among the early Zionists who maintained, there was a little phrase they used, that a land without people for a people without land. That is, they closed their eyes to the presence of what we would call Palestinians. They were not Palestinians then, they were just resident Arabs. But the Palestinian claim, once they arrived in the land, was that Jewish know-how, Jewish technology, and Jewish investment would create such an economic boom in a land that was deeply economically depressed that it would benefit the inhabitants of the land and they would welcome us back. This was Theodor Herzl's dream. Theodor Herzl writes, besides writing The Jewish State, which is his manifesto of Zionism, he writes a really bad novel called Alte Neue Land, which means the old new land. And in the vision of Alte Neue Land, Jews bring all their technology and their culture from Europe, and the inhabitants of the land, the Arabs who live there, welcome them because they've been waiting for somebody to bring them European technology, European culture, and European refinement. And the two cultures get along really nicely because the Arabs are only glad to welcome their brothers home. And there were some movements in this way. I mean, I can give you my own personal little personal experience. The kibbutz that my parents founded in Israel, and I worked on, and my brothers all went to work on the summer times when we were in high school and college. There were 3 Arab villages around the kibbutz, and they got along up until 1973. They got along really well. And even after 73, really 82 was when they had trouble. They got along really well. And the reason they got along really well is because the kibbutz did not crowd out any of the Arab agriculture or the development of those towns. And instead, the kibbutz brought a great deal of wealth into the area. And the kibbutz did a great deal of investment and hired many of the people from the villages to work on the kibbutz. And there was a wonderful sense of symbiosis in that area. We used to go to the villages and eat hummus. And they knew that we were from the kibbutz because we dressed like we're from the kibbutz. We dressed like, filthy farmers. But they welcomed us because there was a sense of, that we were working together to settle the land. That was the Zionist dream, but it didn't always work that way. Because, and Jabotinsky, and Vladimir Jabotinsky, Zev Jabotinsky, who was Menachem Begin's mentor, and Bibi Netanyahu's godfather, literally his godfather. His father was Jabotinsky's secretary. Jabotinsky recognized that, you can't take a land away from people and trade for technology, that the Arabs would never stand for this. But this was Ben-Gurion's dream. And then he tells the story in 1897, the summons of the spiritual father of Jewish state, Theodor Herzl, the first Zionist Congress was proclaimed. And he goes through now why we have a claim to this land. First was the Balfour Declaration in 1917, reinforced by the mandate of the League of Nations. Then the experience of the Holocaust when Jews went to fight against the Nazis, right? Then the 29th of November in 1947, the United Nations Partition Plan. This recognition by the United Nations of the right of the Jewish people to establish their state is irrevocable. This right is the natural right of the Jewish people to be masters of their own fate, like all other nations in their own sovereign state. So here, once he's established the legal right of the Jewish people to the land, he goes back to a more Jeffersonian declaration. This is our natural right. This has been a land that is part of our story since the beginning of time, and therefore it is our natural right, whatever that means, to be masters of our own fate, like all other nations in our own sovereign state. Accordingly, we members of the People's Council, representatives of the Jewish community of Eretz Yisrael, and the Zionist movement are here assembled on this day of the termination of the British mandate, and by virtue of our natural and historic right, and on the strength of the resolution of the United Nations General Assembly. It's interesting, when somebody gives you three reasons for something, you wonder, what if it was only one of them? I mean, did we need the United Nations if we have a natural right to this or a historic right to this? How long do you have to live in a land to have a historic right? And does your historic right ever get suspended if you disappear for a couple of centuries? It's a really sort of interesting question. But you can see what he's arguing against. Why is he giving us so many reasons why we have a connection to the land? Because he knows that that's being questioned. It's being questioned by Arabs, by the Arab nationalists. He's being questioned by certain countries that are allied with the Arabs. It's questioned by the world. Who is this people to show up in this land and suddenly declare their independence? And the answer is, we're not just showing up. This has been our land since the beginning. And we've always had a presence in this land. And this land has been indelible and unerasable and undeniable part of our culture. This is his argument. And then he talks about the future. So up until now, we've been talking about the past. Now we're going to talk about the future. So what kind of country are we going to create? What kind of country are we going to create? And here is his sort of pledge. There's a moment in a wedding when I ask a couple to recite their wedding vows. And I always remind them that wedding vows is not the story of how you met. Wedding vows are in the future tense. What kind of life are we going to have? What kind of family are we going to have? What kind of home are we going to have? And that's what he does in the next section of his declaration. These are their wedding vows, right? The state of Israel will be open for Jewish immigration and for the ingathering of exiles. That's the law of return. The first law of the Knesset was the law of return. If you're Jewish, that is, if you have one Jewish grandparent, you can return to Israel and gain citizenship the moment you set foot on the land. Or even before, if you sign up with Nefesh B'Nefesh. When you get on the El Al flight, you can become a citizen. It will foster the development of the country for the benefit of all of its inhabitants. Now, here we're getting complicated, fellas. Ladies, and look, the first thing says it's open to Jewish immigration, right? And then it says we're going to develop it for the benefit of all of its inhabitants, including the non-Jews. So the question is, which of these two takes precedence? If you have limited housing stock, and you have people who live in the land who need housing, and you have immigrants who are coming who need housing, who gets the housing stock? Where are the resources of this country to be devoted? To what extent, and here's the big question, which is still being debated in Israel today, to what extent is Israel a Jewish state? And to what extent is Israel a state of its citizens? 20% of Israel is not Jewish. 20% of Israel is Arab, Muslim, and Christian. So to what extent are they full citizens, regardless of their cultural background? And to what extent is the state devoted to their welfare? And to what extent is the state devoted to the welfare of Jews who live outside of the land, who are potential citizens should they want to come? But even if they don't come, to what extent are they to be subjects, or are they to be the beneficiaries of Israel's largesse? It will be based on freedom, justice, and peace, as envisioned by the prophets of Israel. It will ensure complete equality of social and political rights to all its inhabitants, irrespective of religion, race, sex. This is the first document, by the way, the first constitutional document in world history to offer equality on the basis of sex, because that was one of the tenets of the Zionist movement. Although on the kibbutz where I lived, the kitchen was always manned by women, and men were not allowed in the children's houses. But the notion of equality, even if it wasn't practiced quite carefully, was something that was always there in front of us. It will guarantee freedom of religion, conscience, language, education, culture. It will safeguard the holy places, which is what the non-Jewish world was most worried about, and will be faithful to the principles of the Charter of the United Nations. We're prepared to cooperate in implementing the resolution, which offers 2 states. We appeal to the United Nations to assist the Jewish people in building this place. We appeal to the very midst of the onslaught, because they knew that a war was coming, launched against us now for many months, to the inhabitants of the state of Israel to preserve peace and participate in the upbuilding of the state, and on the basis of full and equal citizenship and due representation in all of its provisional and permanent institutions. Now, you should know today that something radical is happening in the state of Israel today. My mamish, not like just generally, but mamish today. There's no coalition in the Knesset after this 4th election. And one of the parties that will determine who gets to be the next prime minister and who gets to rule Israel, for the very first time, everyone's courting the Arab parties. Up until this moment in the political history of Israel, the Arab parties, who were always seated in the Knesset, were never invited into the coalition. But the vote was so razor thin, and there's no majority, and there's neither side, as it were, or any side, can gain a majority, that they're now all courting, including Netanyahu, by the way, who has never been identified as a friend of the Arabs in Israel, but he's also courting the Arab parties because he wants to remain prime minister. He also wants to stay out of jail. And so this idea that regardless of religion and culture, you're welcome into the institutions, into the political institutions of the country, has never been an operant principle until today, until right now. And we extend a hand to neighboring states to help us build peace. And we appeal to the Jewish people throughout the diaspora to rally around the Jews of Eretz Yisrael. Now that language is very important. Ben Gurion made a trip to America, and he said to American Jews, you got to come now. Now that we have a country, you got to come. And the American Jewish establishment told him, shh, if you say that, you'll turn us, because there were very few Zionists in the country. And if a prerequisite of Zionism was that you have to make Aliyah, then it would lose all of its support. So here he tried to find a language which would express the desire of the Zionists that Jews come to Israel, but without making it a prerequisite, without making it a requirement. So I spoke last night about supporting Israel, and what a strange paradoxical idea that is. So here's the language: rally round the Jews of Eretz Yisrael and stand by them in the great struggle, but not necessarily to come here. Not necessarily to come here. We don't demand that you come here. We invite you to come here. And then they finished. And there's one more little thing about this document, which is lovely. So you know that from the very beginning, there's been a split between religious and secular. And not just a split between religious and secular, but a violent split. Because you have Haredi religious, you have ultra-Orthodox religion on the one side, and you have what you could call ultra-secular on the other. My parents' kibbutz was a Hashomer Hatzir kibbutz. And the kibbutz, one of the principles of that socialist kibbutz was a complete denial of religion and a rejection. It was a violent rejection of religion. I mean, I used to end up in these big arguments with my friends on the kibbutz because they knew that I was a little bit more religious than they were. So the question is, how do you end the document? You see, you can't say "in God we trust" because if you put God in the document, the ultra seculars are going to object to it. But if you don't say something about God, how have you really reflected the historic culture of Eretz Yisrael, of the Jewish people, and its connection to Eretz Yisrael? So they argued about this until Sharet, who was the lawyer who wrote the document, came up with a remarkable idea. In the book of Deuteronomy, in the poem of Ha'azinu, God is described as Tzur Yisrael. Tzur Yisrael literally means the rock of Israel. In the Bible, it's a metaphor for the divine, for God. But Tzur Yisrael could be a double entendre. It could mean the rock of Israel as God, or it could mean the rock of Israel as, well, rock. In other words, one man's theology is another man's geology. And so he used that phrase, placing our trust in Tzur Yisrael. If you're secular, you mean the rock of Israel. And if you're religious, you mean the rock of Israel. We affix our signatures. And this is the document. It's a remarkable statement of who the Jewish people are and the dreams and aspirations of the Zionists in 1948. Let's stop for just a second. Questions, comments, counter sermons. Let's start with Stanley. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, first of all, wonderful. Secondly,
Oh, thank you. I didn't write it. Ben Gurion and Sharet wrote it. I just presented it.
I attended last night's College of Jewish Studies when you went into everything about Israel and how important it is for us and to us. I recommend finding that on YouTube or whatever and watching it.
I didn't pay him to say this, everybody. I swear to God.
Absolutely. I'm going to send it to my community. And the irony of it was that after last night, I went onto the VBS website and I looked at what was out there, and I saw that you had some kind of a phone call or conversation with Yossi Klein Halevi, and it said April 13th, 2020.
It was last year.
April 13th, more than the 2020. And I started watching it, and I couldn't put together what was happening with what the conversation was. But it's well worth seeing. But knowing now that, of course, it has to do with a year ago and before Passover. But anyway, thank you again.
Yeah, we reposted it. Yeah, I'm sorry. My internet is coming in and out, so I'm trying to listen, but I'm not doing a very good job of it. So,
Was last night recorded?
any other questions? Sorry?
Was last night recorded?
Yeah, it's on YouTube. If you go to the YouTube channel, all of our stuff is waiting there. So hours and hours of to cure insomnia is waiting for you there. So I'm going to wish all of you a very happy Yom Ha'atzmaut. Elise, your daughter's there or here?
My daughter is there, but she is actually moving back June 13th, I believe.
Well, wish her well being there. Let her have a wonderful time, Yom Ha'atzmaut. My internet's coming in and out, so I think it'd be best if we call this to a close. Next week, I'll get it fixed, and we'll go back into the Bible study as we've been doing before. But thank you all for listening, and have a really special and a happy